It all began on a rainy Thursday, the kind where clouds gather not just in the sky, but in the heart as well. Grace stood at the window of her one-room apartment, watching fat raindrops bounce off rusted rooftops, the sound oddly rhythmic, like nature's own percussion. She was 34, with smile lines etched deep into her face, not from her life of ease, but from her defiant refusal to let hardship rob her of joy. Her laughter was legendary in the compound, boisterous, full-bodied and contagious. It echoed through cracked walls and over potholed courtyards, reaching the ears of people too weary to laugh themselves. Everyone said she had a gift, but laughter was her armor, not her story. Beneath that vibrant exterior was a symphony composed not of melodies, but of memories, both sweet and haunting. Her mother had once said, "Life will test your spirit, but don't let it take your sound." And Grace took that literally, crafting joy from chaos, weaving humor into the fabric of her everyday. She was the unofficial therapist of her neighborhood, fixing broken spirits with jokes, cooking up food with stories, and offering shelter in the stormy nights of her friends' lives. Mrs. Taylor, who sold roasted corn on the corner, often said, "If Grace is home, my heart is calm." Yet few knew that Grace cried herself to sleep on most nights. Her laughter came from a well of pain, drawn from years of struggle, losing her father at 12 to a hit-and-run driver, her mother to a stroke 5 years later, and her dreams to poverty's brutal reign. Still, she pressed forward. By day, she worked as a tailor in a corner shop tucked between a bakery and a phone accessories kiosk. Her fingers danced on fabrics, sewing threads into hopes. Customers loved her, not just for her talent, but for the atmosphere she created. They came for clothes, but stayed for the experience. Her lively jokes, her clever banter, and her uncanny ability to make even the saddest bride laugh. But every laugh Grace offered cost her a sliver of herself. Each performance chipped away at the parts she had hidden even from herself. Her life was an orchestra of contrasts. In the morning, she played high notes of cheer, walking to her shop with exaggerated struts that made children giggle and women smile. But at night, she returned to the silence of solitude, where the weight of the day's masquerade crushed her bones. Her tiny radio played old soul tunes, and she would hum along, trying to drown out the internal cacophony. Every so often, she would bring out an old photo album, tattered and stained, yet still sacred. In it, a young girl with wild dreams grinned next to a woman with kind eyes and tired hands, her mother. "You used to laugh too," Grace whispered to the faded photo, "but life made you quiet." That memory hurt the most, watching a once vibrant woman retreat into herself after years of loss and heartache. Grace had sworn not to follow that path, but some nights she feared she already had. The only difference was that she chose to fight back with laughter, to slap life in the face with joy, even if it was artificial. Then came Daniel, the man who dared to listen, not just to her voice, but to the silence between her laughs. He was a school teacher who had moved into the compound 2 months prior, quiet, bookish, and polite to a fault, the kind of man who carried groceries for old women and read poetry in the evening. At first, Grace dismissed him as too soft, too polished for the rough edges of her world. But he surprised her. He laughed at her jokes, not because they were funny, but because they revealed layers of her she didn't know were visible. One evening, as they both stood by the shared outdoor tap, he said, "Your laughter is beautiful, but it's like a song played in a minor key." It struck her like a lightning bolt. No one had ever seen through her so effortlessly. From then on, their conversations deepened. He didn't just ask how her day was, he asked what made her feel alive, what scared her, what dreams she had shelved. Grace felt exposed yet safe, like her soul had finally been given permission to breathe. And in his presence she found a new kind of laughter, gentle, vulnerable, true. But falling in love terrified her. Love meant letting someone behind the curtain. Love meant revealing the silence, the breakdowns, the nights she curled up on the floor because the bed felt too empty. And yet, she allowed it. Slowly, like peeling layers of an onion, Grace revealed herself to Daniel. Her grief, her guilt, her desperate desire to be more than just a clown in everyone's circus. And he stayed. When she had panic attacks, he held her without trying to fix her. When she withdrew, he waited patiently on the other side of the wall she built. "You don't have to be funny for me," he said once, gently lifting her chin to meet his gaze. "Your silence is also beautiful." And that made her weep harder than any sorrow had ever made her. In those moments, she realized her laughter had never been the full symphony, only the opening act. The rest was just beginning. With Daniel, she started composing a new kind of music, one that included pauses, silence, honesty, and healing. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also liberating. Because for the first time in her adult life, Grace was laughing not to survive, but to live. Grace had always believed that joy was something you loaned out, not something you kept. But as months passed with Daniel, something began to shift. For the first time in years, she started to collect joy like keepsakes. Quiet mornings spent reading together, fingers entwined over cups of coffee, laughter that bubbled up from shared glances, not forced punchlines. Her neighbours noticed the change. "You look softer," Mrs. Taylor observed one afternoon as she handed Grace a piece of roasted corn. Grace smiled, realizing she hadn't even noticed the absence of her usual mask. She still laughed, yes, but not as a shield. It had become a bridge. Her tailoring shop evolved too, not in size or profit, but in presence. People still came, but now they stayed to share their own stories. Grace had created a space not just for clothes, but for healing. She stitched fabric by day and stitched hearts by listening. Even the kids who once came to mimic her walk began to mimic her empathy. She had unknowingly started a ripple, and yet there remained shadows. On certain nights, when Daniel was away or the city's power cut left her alone in silence, the memories returned, uninvited. Her mother's worn-out face, her father's unfinished goodbye. The weight of being everyone's lighthouse when she felt shipwrecked inside. But Grace had learned something powerful from Daniel. Healing wasn't the absence of pain, but the ability to keep loving through it. And so she embraced both the brightness and the dark. She talked to Daniel about her mother without guilt, no longer fearing that her sadness would scare him away. She laughed with him without performance, and when she cried, she no longer apologized. Together, they built a rhythm, not a fairy tale, but something better, honest, raw, and real. Grace also started volunteering on weekends at a community centre nearby, teaching sewing to young girls. She saw herself in them, especially in Leah, a wide-eyed 13-year-old with a stutter and a laugh that reminded Grace of herself before life tried to silence her. One afternoon, Leah asked, "Miss Grace, were you always happy?" The question struck a chord. Grace crouched beside her, took her hand and said, "No, but I learned that laughter is like light. It finds you when you make room for it." That night, Grace wept, not out of sorrow, but from a deep well of release. She wasn't pretending anymore. She was no longer just the neighborhood's joy dispenser. She was finally living for herself, not through performance, but through presence. And then one crisp Sunday morning, Daniel proposed. It wasn't grand. No rose petals, no violin quartet, just the two of them on a bench in the park where they had first shared their stories. "Grace," he said, "you taught me that people laugh to hide and to heal. I want to be there for both. Will you marry me?" She didn't answer right away, not because she doubted, but because she was allowing herself to feel every ounce of that moment. All her life, Grace had rushed joy, afraid it might vanish if she didn't clutch it quickly. But this time, she breathed it in. And then she said yes, not just to Daniel, but to herself. Yes to a life of unforced laughter. Yes to healing without shame. Yes to a symphony that allowed silence and vulnerability and imperfections. Their wedding was small and filled with echoes of community. Mrs. Taylor crying in the front row, Leah wearing a dress Grace helped her sew, laughter rising not from rehearsed jokes but spontaneous joy. The whole day felt like an exhale, and Grace, standing beneath a sky that once mirrored her sorrow, looked up and whispered, "You'd be proud, Mom," because she had become everything her mother wanted for her, resilient, radiant, and finally fully heard. The years rolled on, and Grace and Daniel's home became a haven. They didn't live extravagantly, but they lived meaningfully. On their porch hung a sign painted by one of Grace's students, "Welcome to the Symphony." And every evening, as the city hummed and children's giggles spilled into twilight, Grace would sit with Daniel, hand in hand, heart wide open. Her laugh still rang through the neighborhood, only now it was joined by others. Together they had composed something rare. a life where joy wasn't just a melody but a movement, ever evolving, ever generous. Grace had once believed that laughter was her armour, but now she knew it was her legacy.